The phone didn't ring on Thanksgiving. And that silence, more than anything that came before it, told Lola Fry's family everything they needed to know. She wasn't the type to forget. Birthdays, holidays, Sunday dinners at her mother's house in Greenwood. Kathy, as her family called her, showed up. Always. She was the one who remembered. The one who called. The one who, even in the chaos of trying to rebuild her life, never let the people she loved wonder if she was okay. But on Thanksgiving Day 1993, the phone stayed silent. 4 days earlier, on November 18th, her sister Laverne Barker had filed a missing persons report with the Indiana State Police. Lola Katherine Fry, 28 years old, had last been seen leaving Greenwood in her red and black Mitsubishi Eclipse. The car had personalized plates. Bold letters. LLA. The kind of car you'd notice. The kind of car you couldn't miss. And yet, somehow, it had vanished. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy true crime stories like this, make sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Lola Katherine Fry was born on February 20th, 1965, in Indiana. She grew up in Greenwood, a suburb just south of Indianapolis, in a close-knit family. She had 4 sisters, Laverne, Darlene, and 2 others, and her parents, Donald and Delphia Coleman, raised them with an emphasis on loyalty and love. Her mother would later write a poem about her. About the empty chair at the table, the candle that couldn't be lit, the grave that didn't exist. But in the years before everything fell apart, Kathy was just a young woman trying to figure out who she was. Her family had nicknames for her. Kathy, Cat, Lola B. She was playful with her siblings, reserved with strangers. She wasn't loud. She wasn't someone who drew attention in a room full of people. But if you knew her, you knew she cared. Deeply. She wanted the things a lot of people want. Marriage, children, stability, a life that felt solid beneath her feet. By 1993, she was working toward that. For years, Lola had been employed as an exotic dancer in Indianapolis. She worked at Brad's Gold Club and another establishment called PT's. It was work that paid the bills, but it wasn't what she wanted forever. She had filed a lawsuit, along with other dancers, against a plastic surgeon and the owner of Brad's Gold Club, alleging malpractice and fraud related to breast implant surgeries. The lawsuit named the surgeon, the club owner, and Dow Corning, the company that manufactured the silicone gel implants. It was a serious case. Depositions were scheduled. Lawyers were involved. And on November 15, 1993, Lola was supposed to give her final deposition. She never showed up. By November of 1993, Lola had quit her job at the club. She was in the middle of moving to Fort Wayne, a city about 2 hours northeast of Indianapolis, to live with her older sister, Laverne Barker. The plan was simple: start fresh. Go back to school. Build something new. She was excited about it. Laverne remembered her sister talking about the future, about what came next, about finally getting to be the person she'd always wanted to be. But Lola still had belongings in Indianapolis. Clothes, personal items, things she needed to pack up before she could fully settle in Fort Wayne. So in mid-November, she made the drive back to Greenwood to collect a few more things. It was supposed to be a short trip. 4 or 5 days, maybe. Just long enough to grab what she needed and head back. She only packed clothes for a few days. On November 13th, 1993, Lola went to a party. It was held at an apartment in East Indianapolis. The apartment belonged to her hairstylist, a friend she'd known for a while. It wasn't a formal event. Just people hanging out, drinking, talking. Lola wasn't alone. Her former boyfriend, John Riker, was there. So were several other people. Friends, acquaintances, people who, later, would all tell the same story. At least at first. According to a search warrant affidavit filed years later, the party involved more than just alcohol. Cocaine was present. Marijuana. Prescription medication. People were using. People were drinking. And at some point during the night, Lola Katherine Fry lost consciousness. Witnesses would later describe what happened next. They said she passed out. Some speculated she'd overdosed. Others said she'd just had too much. But whatever the reason, she was no longer awake. No longer responsive. And that's when John Riker picked her up. He carried her out of the apartment, wrapped in a blanket. Unconscious. He put her in his car and drove away. When police first interviewed everyone who'd been at the party, they all said the same thing. Kathy left with John. Voluntarily. She was fine. She was awake. She walked out on her own 2 feet. But that wasn't true. It would take 7 years for the truth to surface. 7 years before 2 of the men who'd been at the party finally admitted they'd lied. They hadn't wanted to get involved. Hadn't wanted to be part of whatever happened next. So they said what everyone else said. That Kathy left with John. That she was fine. But she wasn't fine. She was unconscious. John Riker's story was straightforward. Consistent. He told police that after leaving the party, he took Lola back to his residence in Greenwood. His home was located near the intersection of Indiana Route 135 and Fairview Road. He said she was with him that night. That she stayed at his place. And then, early the next morning, around 7 o'clock or 7:30 a.m., he said he had to leave for a work call. He was employed in a job that required him to respond to service requests, and that morning, he got one. Before he left, he said, Lola told him she would get ready and head to Fort Wayne. She was supposed to drive herself 2 hours north, to her sister's house. John said he was gone for about an hour, maybe a little more. And when he came back, Lola was gone. Her car was gone. Everything was gone. He allowed police to search his home. They went through it carefully, looking for signs of a struggle. Blood. Anything that would indicate something violent had happened there. They found nothing. No forensic evidence. No signs of foul play. But they also found no proof that Lola had ever left on her own. John Riker took 2 polygraph tests. He failed both of them. But failing a polygraph isn't the same as being charged with a crime. Polygraphs aren't admissible in court. They're tools. Indicators. Not proof. And without proof, there was nothing police could do. The car became the central mystery almost immediately. A red and black 1990 Mitsubishi Eclipse. 2-door. Sport model. With personalized Indiana license plates that read Lola. It wasn't a subtle car. It wasn't the kind of vehicle that blended into traffic. It was bright. Distinctive. The kind of car people noticed. And yet, from the moment Lola disappeared, no one saw it. No sightings on the highway between Greenwood and Fort Wayne. No reports of it parked somewhere unusual. No abandoned vehicle discovered weeks or months later in a field, a lake, a storage unit. It was as if the car had simply ceased to exist. Detective William Vann, who worked the case for the Indiana State Police years later, would tell reporters that the car was one of the most puzzling aspects of the entire investigation. Somebody had to do something with the car, he said. Short of putting it into water or a storage facility, there's limited things someone could do with a car. But wherever it went, it stayed hidden. Lola's family knew something was wrong almost immediately. She was supposed to call. She was supposed to check in. And when days went by without contact, her sister Laverne made the decision to file a missing persons report. That was November 18, 1993. For days after Lola was last seen, investigators started working the case right away. They interviewed everyone who'd been at the party. They talked to John Riker. They searched his home. They followed up on tips. Because tips came in. Lots of them. People called to say they'd seen Lola. Seen her car. Seen someone who looked like her at a gas station, a restaurant, a rest stop along I-65. But every lead went nowhere. None of the sightings could be confirmed. None of the tips led to Lola. Or her car. And then Thanksgiving arrived. And the phone didn't ring. Delphia Coleman, Lola's mother, waited by the phone that day. She waited for her daughter to call and say she was okay. To say she'd be there for Christmas. To say she was sorry for worrying everyone. But the call never came. And in that silence, Delphia began to understand what her heart had been trying to tell her since November 14th. Lola wasn't coming home. Batch 2. The investigation into Lola Katherine Fry's disappearance became official on November 18th, 1993, but the real work, the kind that keeps detectives awake at night, began the moment her family realized she hadn't just taken off for a few days. Because people don't just disappear. Not like this. Not when they're planning to give a deposition the next day. Not when their bank accounts go untouched. Not when their car, a car impossible to miss, vanishes without a single confirmed sighting. Indiana State Police took the lead. The case was assigned to investigators who specialized in missing persons. They worked methodically. Interviews. Background checks. Forensic searches. But from the beginning, there was a problem. Time. Every hour that passed without finding Lola meant evidence degraded. Memories became less reliable. Witnesses had time to coordinate their stories. And whoever knew what happened, whether they were responsible or just afraid, had time to cover their tracks. The window was closing, and everyone involved knew it. The timeline became the spine of the investigation. November 13th, 1993, Lola attends a party at her hairstylist's apartment in East Indianapolis. Multiple witnesses present. Drugs and alcohol confirmed. Lola loses consciousness. John Riker carries her out, wrapped in a blanket. November 14th, 1993. According to Riker, Lola spends the night at his residence near the intersection of Route 135 and Fairview Road in Greenwood. He claims she's alive and conscious when he leaves for work around 7 a.m. When he returns approximately 1 hour later, she's gone. Her car is gone. November 15th, 1993. Lola is scheduled to give her final deposition in the breast implant lawsuit. She doesn't appear. Attorneys try to contact her. No response. November 18th, 1993. Laverne Barker files a missing persons report with Indiana State Police. November 25th, 1993. Thanksgiving. No contact from Lola. For days. That's the gap between the last confirmed sighting and the missing persons report. For days where anything could have happened. Investigators focused on John Riker almost immediately. He was the last person known to have been with Lola. He admitted taking her from the party. He admitted she stayed at his residence. And his story, that she simply left on her own while he was gone for an hour, raised more questions than it answered. Why would Lola, who had just been unconscious hours earlier, wake up and drive herself 2 hours to Fort Wayne without telling anyone? Without calling her sister to say she was on the way? Why would she leave without her belongings from Greenwood? She'd only packed clothes for 4 or 5 days. She still had things to collect. And most importantly, where was her car? John Riker allowed police to search his home. Not once, but multiple times over the years. They brought cadaver dogs, forensic technicians, ground-penetrating radar. They found nothing that directly linked him to Lola's disappearance. But they also found nothing that proved his story was true. The polygraph tests complicated things. 2 tests, 2 failures. But polygraphs measure physiological responses, heart rate, blood pressure, respiration. They don't prove guilt, and they're not admissible in court. So even though John Riker failed both tests, even though he was the last person to see Lola alive, even though his story had gaps that investigators couldn't fill, without physical evidence, there was no case. No arrest. No charges. Just suspicion. Then there was the lawsuit. Lola Katherine Fry, along with several other women, had filed a civil complaint against plastic surgeon Dr. E.J. Graves, Brad's Gold Club owner Brad Bickle, and Dow Corning Corporation. The lawsuit alleged fraud, malpractice, and negligence related to silicone breast implant surgeries. The plaintiffs claimed they'd been pressured into getting the implants, that they'd been misled about the risks, that the surgeries had been performed improperly, leading to complications, health issues, and emotional distress. It was a serious case. Financial stakes were significant. Reputations were on the line. And Lola was one of the key witnesses. Her final deposition, the last formal testimony before the case potentially went to trial, was scheduled for November 15, 1993. She disappeared on November 14th. The timing was impossible to ignore. Investigators looked into it. They interviewed everyone connected to the lawsuit. Dr. Graves, Brad Bickle, the attorneys, other plaintiffs. They found no evidence of foul play, no threats, no attempts to intimidate witnesses, no financial motive strong enough to warrant murder. But the timing still haunted the case. Because in investigations like this, coincidences don't sit well. When someone disappears the day before they're supposed to testify in a lawsuit worth potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars, people ask questions. Was it truly a coincidence? Or was Lola silenced before she could speak? To this day, no one connected to the breast implant lawsuit has ever been formally named as a suspect or person of interest in Lola's disappearance. The lawsuit eventually settled. The case closed. But the question remained. Search efforts intensified in the weeks and months following Lola's disappearance. Volunteers from the community joined law enforcement. They combed through fields, forests, abandoned buildings. They checked rest stops along I-65, the main highway connecting Indianapolis to Fort Wayne. They followed up on every tip, every sighting, every rumor. Someone said they saw Lola at a truck stop near Lafayette. Investigators drove out, interviewed staff, reviewed surveillance footage. Nothing. Someone else called to say they'd seen a red and black Mitsubishi Eclipse parked behind a storage facility in Greenwood. Police responded immediately. Different car. Different plates. Another caller reported seeing a woman matching Lola's description getting into a vehicle with two men near the Greenwood Park Mall. Detectives tracked down the men, interviewed them, cleared them. Every lead was a dead end. And with each failed search, the likelihood of finding Lola alive diminished. Bloodhounds were brought in, trained search dogs, capable of picking up human scent even days after someone has been in a location, were deployed in areas connected to the investigation. The dogs led handlers to several locations where items were found, items that appeared to have blood on them. The discovery sent investigators into overdrive. Forensic teams collected the evidence, sent it to labs for analysis. But the results were inconclusive. The technology in 1993 wasn't what it is today. DNA testing was available, but it was slower, more expensive, and required larger samples. And without a clear chain of custody, without knowing definitively that the items belonged to Lola or were connected to her disappearance, the evidence couldn't move the case forward. Still, the discovery reinforced what investigators already suspected. Something had happened to Lola Katherine Fry. Something violent. Laverne Barker became the public face of the family's grief. She spoke to reporters. She pleaded for information. She worked with private investigators, spending money the family didn't have, chasing leads police couldn't or wouldn't follow. Laverne believed her sister was dead. She said it plainly in interviews. No hesitation. No false hope. "We just want to bring her home," she told a local news station in 2000. "We want to bury her. We want a place to go and mourn." But without a body, there was nowhere to go. No grave to visit on holidays. No headstone to lay flowers at. No place to sit and talk to Kathy the way you talk to people you've lost. Just an empty space where a sister used to be. Delphia Coleman, Lola's mother, wrote a poem years later. It was read at a vigil held in Lola's memory. The poem spoke of an empty chair at the Thanksgiving table, a candle that couldn't be blown out, a daughter who never came home. It ended with a single line. "We love you, Kathy. And we're still waiting." By the year 2000, the case had gone cold. Not officially. Investigators still considered it an active missing persons case. But the leads had dried up. The tips had stopped coming. And without new evidence, there was nowhere else to look. Then something changed. Two men who had been at the party on November 13, 1993, men who had initially told police that Lola left the party conscious and on her own, came forward with a different story. They said they'd lied. They admitted that Lola had been unconscious when John Riker carried her out. They said they hadn't wanted to get involved, hadn't wanted to be dragged into an investigation. So they told investigators what everyone else was saying. That Kathy was fine. That she walked out on her own. But she hadn't. And 7 years later, they couldn't live with the lie anymore. The admission changed everything. It meant John Riker's story, that Lola had been awake and functional when she left with him, was contradicted by witnesses. It meant the timeline was different than investigators had initially believed. It meant Lola Katherine Fry had been unconscious, vulnerable, and completely dependent on the man who claimed to have taken her home safely. Armed with this new information, police obtained a search warrant. And in August of 2000, they began digging. The excavation took place near Greenwood, in an area connected to the investigation. Police brought in backhoes, forensic anthropologists, cadaver dogs. The search was part of a broader effort. Investigators were looking into two other missing women cases that shared similarities with Lola's disappearance. Women who had vanished without a trace. Women whose cars had never been found. The media covered the excavation extensively. Cameras lined the perimeter. Reporters gave live updates. Laverne Barker stood at a distance, watching, hoping, dreading. The dig lasted several days. They found nothing. No remains. No personal effects. No car parts. Nothing that brought them closer to finding Lola Katherine Fry. The failure of the excavation was devastating. Not just for the family, but for investigators who had believed, genuinely believed, that they were about to close the case. That they were about to give Delphia Coleman the closure she'd been praying for. But the ground was empty, and the questions remained. Where was Lola? Where was her car? And who, if anyone, knew the truth? Batch 3. The years after the failed excavation were marked by silence. Not the kind of silence that brings peace. The kind that suffocates. The kind that fills rooms where families used to gather and makes holidays feel like endurance tests. Lola's mother, Delphia, kept a candle burning. Literally. In her home in Greenwood, there was always a candle lit for Kathy. A small flame that represented hope, or maybe just refusal. Refusal to accept that her daughter was gone without knowing what happened. Laverne continued working with private investigators. She spent hours on the phone with tipsters, psychics, amateur sleuths who claimed they knew where Lola was buried. Some of them were well-meaning. Some were cruel. Some just wanted attention. But Laverne followed every lead. Because what else could she do? The private investigator's name hasn't been widely publicized, but his theory became central to the family's understanding of what might have happened. He believed Lola died shortly after leaving the party. He believed her death was accidental, most likely an overdose, given the drugs present at the party and the fact that witnesses confirmed she'd lost consciousness. But he also believed that what happened next wasn't accidental. Someone panicked. Someone made a decision. And that decision involved hiding a body and a car so well that decades later, neither has been found. The investigator's theory centered on geography. He believed Lola's body was somewhere east of the Edinburgh exit off Interstate 65. Edinburgh is a small town in Johnson County, Indiana, roughly halfway between Indianapolis and Columbus. It's rural. Farmland. Stretches of privately owned property where someone could bury something, or someone, without being seen. The investigator pointed specifically to two areas, near the town of Hope and near Schaefer Lake. Hope is tiny, population less than 2,000, surrounded by agricultural land and wooded areas. The kind of place where people know their neighbors, but also where large plots of land sit undisturbed for years. Schaefer Lake is a small body of water in Bartholomew County, not far from Hope. It's not a major recreation area. It's not heavily trafficked. It's quiet. And according to the investigator, it's the kind of place where a car could be submerged and never found. But here's the problem with that theory. It requires someone to have extensive knowledge of the area. Someone who knew the land well enough to find a spot where a body could be buried without being discovered. Someone who understood the terrain, the water depth, the sight lines from nearby roads. Someone local, or someone who had help from someone local. John Riker lived in Greenwood. He was familiar with the area. But nothing in the investigation suggests he had connections to farmland near Hope or Schaefer Lake. So if the investigator's theory is correct, it raises another question. Who helped? Laverne Barker has her own theory. She believes Lola died in John Riker's residence. She believes whatever happened, whether it was an overdose, a medical emergency, or something more sinister, occurred while Lola was unconscious and vulnerable. And she believes Riker panicked. He didn't mean for it to happen, Laverne said in an interview years later. But when it did, he made a choice. And that choice was to hide what he'd done. Laverne believes Lola's body and car were taken to private property, somewhere remote, somewhere only accessible to people who owned the land or had permission to be there. She doesn't believe Lola was buried on Riker's property. Police searched it too many times, too thoroughly. If she'd been there, they would have found her. But she does believe Riker knows where she is. Or at the very least, knows who does. The question of the car haunts every theory. Because hiding a body is one thing. Bodies are small. They can be buried in shallow graves, placed in water, concealed in ways that make them nearly impossible to find without specific information. But a car? A car is massive. It weighs thousands of pounds. It's made of metal and glass and materials that don't decompose. It can't be buried in a shallow grave. It can't be easily dismantled by hand. So what do you do with a bright red and black Mitsubishi Eclipse with personalized plates that read Lola? Detective William Vann, who worked the case for Indiana State Police, has said repeatedly that the car is the key to solving the case. If we find the car, we find Lola, he told reporters in 2009. But despite decades of searching, the car has never been located. Not in a lake. Not in a junkyard. Not in a storage facility. Not abandoned on the side of a rural highway. It's as if it was erased from existence. There are really only a few possibilities. Possibility 1. The car was submerged in water. This is the theory many investigators favor. Indiana has countless lakes, ponds, quarries, and reservoirs. Many of them are deep. Many are murky. And in 1993, the technology to search underwater wasn't as advanced as it is today. If someone drove the car into a lake, weighted it down, and left it there, It could still be sitting at the bottom right now. Undiscovered. Unreported. Hidden beneath years of sediment and algae. But which lake? Indiana has hundreds of bodies of water. Searching them all would take years and cost millions of dollars. And without a specific tip or lead pointing to a particular location, it's an impossible task. Possibility 2. The car was crushed and scrapped. In 1993, salvage yards and scrap metal facilities weren't as regulated as they are today. It was possible, though difficult, to bring in a vehicle, have it crushed, and sell it for scrap metal without raising red flags. If someone had connections to a junkyard, or if they were willing to pay cash and ask no questions, the car could have been destroyed within days of Lola's disappearance. But this theory has problems too. Crushing a car isn't quiet. It's not subtle. And in a small community like Greenwood, word spreads. Someone would have seen something. Someone would have talked. Unless they were paid not to. Possibility 3. The car was hidden on private property. This is Laverne's theory. That the car was driven onto a large piece of privately owned land. A farm, a wooded lot, an industrial property, and left there. Maybe in a barn. Maybe in a shed. Maybe just covered with a tarp and left to rust. Private property is difficult to search without a warrant. And without probable cause, police can't just knock on doors and demand access to every barn and outbuilding in a 50-mile radius. So if the car is on private land, it could be sitting there right now, decaying, forgotten, waiting for someone to stumble across it by accident, or waiting for the person who put it there to finally say where it is. The breast implant lawsuit resurfaced periodically in discussions about Lola's disappearance. Not because investigators found evidence connecting it to her vanishing, but because the timing was too strange to ignore. Lola was scheduled to give her final deposition on November 15, 1993. It was supposed to be the last major step before the case moved forward. Her testimony would have been critical. She was one of several women who alleged malpractice, fraud, and coercion. And then, the day before she was supposed to testify, she vanished. Could someone have wanted to prevent her from speaking? Theoretically, yes. But there's a gap between theory and evidence. No one connected to the lawsuit has ever been named as a suspect. No one involved has been credibly linked to Lola's disappearance. And investigators found no financial motive strong enough to warrant murder. Dr. E.J. Graves, the plastic surgeon named in the lawsuit, cooperated with police. He provided alibis. He was never charged with anything related to Lola's case. Brad Bickle, the owner of Brad's Gold Club, was similarly cooperative. No evidence tied him to her disappearance. And Dow Corning, the corporation that manufactured the implants, had no apparent reason to target one plaintiff out of thousands across the country. So while the timing remains suspicious, the evidence doesn't support the theory that Lola was silenced because of the lawsuit. At least, not the evidence that's been made public. In 2009, the case received renewed media attention. The Indianapolis Star ran a feature story on Lola's disappearance, interviewing family members, detectives, and people connected to the original investigation. The article reignited public interest. Tips started coming in again. People who remembered seeing something in 1993. People who had heard rumors. People who wanted to help. But once again, the tips led nowhere. Detective Van worked the case tirelessly. He re-interviewed witnesses. He reviewed old evidence with fresh eyes. He consulted with forensic experts who specialized in cold cases. He even reached out to psychics. Not because he believed in them, he said, but because he was willing to try anything. If someone calls and says they had a dream about where Lola is buried, I'm going to listen, Van told the Star. Because you never know. Sometimes the smallest thing breaks a case wide open. But the smallest thing never came. Laverne Barker gave an interview that year. She was 56 years old. She'd been searching for her sister for 16 years. She talked about the emotional toll. About how hard it was to move forward when you didn't know if your sister was alive or dead. About how holidays felt hollow. About how every time the phone rang, a part of her hoped it was news. She talked about anger, too. Anger at whoever was responsible. Anger at a system that couldn't, or wouldn't, charge someone without a body. Anger at the years that had passed without answers. But mostly, she talked about love. Kathy was my sister, Laverne said. And I made her a promise. I promised I would never stop looking. I promised I would bring her home. And she meant it. The case was officially classified as a missing persons investigation, but everyone involved treated it as a homicide. Because missing persons cases, statistically, don't stay missing forever. People turn up. They call home. They're found living under assumed names in different states. But Lola never called. Her bank accounts were never accessed. Her social security number was never used. No one matching her description was ever found living anywhere in the country. She didn't run away. She didn't start a new life. She died. And someone knows where. In missing persons investigations, there's a concept called the burden of the unsaid. It refers to the weight carried by people who know something but choose not to speak. Maybe they're afraid. Maybe they're protecting someone. Maybe they've convinced themselves that what they know doesn't matter. But the burden grows heavier over time. Because secrets don't stay buried as neatly as bodies. They surface in small ways. In offhand comments. In drunken confessions. In deathbed admissions. And investigators know this. They know that cases like Lola's often break years, sometimes decades, later, when someone who's been carrying the truth finally decides they can't carry it anymore. So they wait. And they hope that someone who was at that party in November 1993 will finally say what they saw. That someone who helped dispose of a body or hide a car will finally admit what they did. That someone who's been protecting John Riker, or protecting themselves, will finally decide that the truth matters more than the lie. Batch 4. By 2010, Lola Katherine Fry had been missing for 17 years. Her mother, Delphia Coleman, was in her 70s. Her sisters were growing older. The people who remembered Lola as a vibrant 28-year-old woman were becoming fewer. Time wasn't just passing. It was eroding. Witnesses were forgetting details. Documents were deteriorating. People connected to the case were dying. And with each death, the possibility of finding the truth grew smaller. But something else was happening too. Technology was advancing. DNA analysis had improved dramatically since 1993. What required large samples and weeks of processing in the early 90s could now be done with microscopic traces in a matter of days. Ground-penetrating radar had become more sophisticated, capable of detecting disturbances in soil that would have been invisible to earlier equipment. Databases had expanded. Missing persons cases from across the country were now cross-referenced digitally. Unidentified remains found in one state could be compared against missing persons reports from another. And social media had created a new kind of investigative tool. Online communities dedicated to cold cases began forming. Amateur sleuths, retired detectives, forensic enthusiasts, they gathered on forums and Facebook groups to discuss unsolved disappearances. Lola's case was among them. On these forums, people debated theories. They analyzed the timeline. They studied maps of Johnson County, Bartholomew County, and the areas surrounding Greenwood. Some users claimed to have insider knowledge. Family friends, former neighbors, people who'd heard rumors back in 1993 but never came forward. Others offered their own theories. Elaborate scenarios involving organized crime, human trafficking, witness protection programs. Most of it was speculation. Noise. But occasionally, someone would post something that felt real. A comment about a property near Hope, where locals always said something was buried. A mention of a lake that someone's uncle used to dump stolen cars into back in the 90s. A story about a scrapyard owner who bragged, years ago, about crushing a car with custom plates and no questions asked. Investigators monitored these forums. They followed up on credible leads. But still, nothing broke the case. The emotional toll on Lola's family was immeasurable. Laverne Barker developed health problems. Stress-related, doctors said. The kind of chronic conditions that come from years of carrying impossible weight. She still worked with private investigators. Still fielded calls from psychics and tipsters. Still drove out to rural properties when someone claimed they knew where Lola was buried. Every time, she hoped. Every time, she was disappointed. Delphia Coleman's health declined too. She was aging. Her body was failing. And she knew, consciously, painfully, that she might die without ever knowing what happened to her daughter. The not knowing was worse than grief. Grief has a shape. It has stages. It has a path you can walk, even if the walking is slow and agonizing. But ambiguity doesn't have a path. It just circles, endlessly. In 2013, 20 years after Lola's disappearance, Laverne gave another interview. She was 60 years old. Her voice was tired, but her conviction hadn't wavered. "I know she's out there," Laverne said. "I know someone put her somewhere. And I know they thought they'd gotten away with it." She paused. "But they haven't. Not really. Because we're still here. We're still looking, and we're not going to stop. The interviewer asked if Laverne believed John Riker was responsible. Laverne chose her words carefully. I believe he was the last person to see my sister alive, she said. I believe he knows more than he's told anyone. And I believe if he wanted to, he could end this today. But John Riker had stopped speaking publicly about the case years earlier. He'd moved on with his life. And legally, there was nothing anyone could do to compel him to say more. The passage of time created another problem. Witnesses were dying. People who'd been at the party on November 13, 1993, were getting older. Some had moved away. Some had health issues. Some had simply disappeared from public view. And when witnesses die, their testimony dies with them. Anything they might have remembered, details they didn't think were important, conversations they overheard, things they saw but didn't report, all of it vanished. Investigators knew this. They re-interviewed as many people as they could. They recorded statements. They preserved whatever information remained. But it wasn't enough. Because the people who knew what really happened that night weren't talking. And they might never talk. One of the persistent questions surrounding Lola's case was this. Could she still be alive? Statistically, it was possible. There are rare cases of people who disappear and resurface decades later. Women who were abducted and held captive. People who suffered head trauma and forgot their identities. Individuals who, for reasons known only to them, walked away from their lives and never looked back. But Lola didn't fit those profiles. She had strong family ties. She was in the middle of a lawsuit. She had plans, concrete plans, to move to Fort Wayne and start over. She wasn't the kind of person who would vanish voluntarily and leave her family in anguish for 30 years. And more importantly, her car vanished with her. If Lola had chosen to disappear, why take a car that was so distinctive? Why not leave it behind and travel some other way? The car's disappearance was proof, circumstantial, but compelling, that whatever happened to Lola wasn't voluntary. Someone else was involved. And that someone wanted her gone. The theories about what happened to Lola essentially broke down into two categories: accidental death with a cover-up, or intentional homicide. The accidental death theory. This theory holds that Lola overdosed or died from some other medical emergency shortly after leaving the party. Perhaps while unconscious at John Riker's residence. Perhaps before she even arrived there. When Riker realized she was dead, he panicked. He couldn't call 911. Couldn't take her to a hospital. Because doing so would have meant admitting that he'd taken an unconscious woman from a party where drugs were present. It would have meant potential criminal charges. Possible jail time. So he made a choice. He disposed of her body, hid her car, and then told everyone she'd left on her own. Under this theory, John Riker isn't a murderer. He's a man who made a catastrophic decision in a moment of fear. But that distinction doesn't change the outcome. Lola is still dead. Her family still doesn't have answers. And Riker still chose to hide the truth. The intentional homicide theory. This theory is darker. It suggests that something happened while Lola was unconscious. Something violent. Something that resulted in her death. Maybe it was assault. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was something else entirely. But under this theory, Lola didn't die by accident. She was killed. And the cover-up wasn't just panic. It was self-preservation. Both theories fit the known facts. Both explain why Lola's body and car were never found. Both account for John Riker being the last person to see her alive. But without evidence, without a body, a confession, or a witness willing to come forward, there's no way to know which theory is correct. Indiana State Police continued to treat the case as an active investigation. Detective Van retired in the mid-2010s, but the case was passed to new investigators who brought fresh perspectives. They reviewed the evidence again. They re-examined the failed excavation from 2000. They consulted with experts in forensic anthropology, cadaver dog handling, and ground-penetrating radar technology. They also reached out to other jurisdictions. Because Lola's case wasn't the only unsolved disappearance in central Indiana during the 1990s. Several women had vanished under similar circumstances. Young women. Women connected to nightlife. Women whose cars were never found. Was there a connection? Investigators explored the possibility. They compared timelines, locations, known associates. But ultimately, they found no evidence linking Lola's case to the others. Each disappearance seemed to be its own tragedy. Its own mystery. Not part of a pattern. Just individual acts of violence or concealment. Which, in some ways, made it worse. Because if Lola's case had been part of a larger pattern, there might have been more resources, more attention, more pressure to solve it. But as a single missing persons case in a small Indiana town, it risked being forgotten. Laverne Barker refused to let that happen. She became an advocate for other families dealing with missing loved ones. She spoke at vigils. She attended conferences on cold cases. She worked with organizations that helped fund searches and DNA testing. She turned her grief into purpose. Because if she couldn't bring Kathy home, maybe she could help someone else bring their loved one home. Maybe she could make sure no other family had to live with the same ambiguity, the same endless waiting. In 2018, 25 years after Lola's disappearance, a new development emerged. A man came forward claiming he had information about the case. He said he'd been at a party, not the one in November 1993, but a different gathering several months later, where someone had made a drunken comment about getting rid of a girl in her car. The comment had been vague. The man didn't know if it was related to Lola's case or just drunken bravado, but it had stuck with him. And 25 years later, he finally decided to report it. Investigators followed up immediately. They interviewed the man. They tried to identify who had made the comment. They searched for any corroborating evidence. But the lead went cold. The person who allegedly made the comment had died years earlier. There were no other witnesses. No documentation. No way to verify the story. It was another dead end. But it was also a reminder of something important. People talk. Maybe not right away. Maybe not to the police. But people talk. At parties. In bars. To friends they trust. And sometimes, years later, those conversations come back. The question that haunted everyone who worked Lola's case was simple. What would it take to solve it? The answer was equally simple. Someone needs to talk. Because the physical evidence was gone. The forensic leads had been exhausted. The searches had turned up nothing. The only thing left was testimony. Someone, somewhere, knows what happened. Maybe they were at the party. Maybe they helped dispose of the body. Maybe they were told about it later and kept quiet. But they know. And until they speak, Lola Katherine Fry will remain missing. Her family will remain in limbo. And the person responsible, whether they panicked or planned, whether they acted alone or had help, will continue living with the secret. Secrets have a way of surfacing, though. Not always when you expect them to. Not always in ways you can predict. But they surface. A deathbed confession. A divorce that turns bitter. A falling out between friends. Investigators had seen it happen before. Cases that had been cold for 30, 40, even 50 years suddenly breaking because someone decided they couldn't carry the weight anymore. And they believed, hoped, that Lola's case would be the same. That one day, a phone would ring. A voice on the other end would say, "I need to tell you something. About Lola Fry." And finally, after decades of waiting, the truth would come out. Batch 5. There's a database called NAMAS, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. It's a federal database that catalogs missing persons cases and unidentified remains across the United States. Anyone can access it. Law enforcement, families, the general public. Lola Katherine Fry is listed there. Case number MP 795. Her entry includes her physical description. 5 feet 5 inches tall, 120 pounds, brown hair, green eyes. Scars on her right knee and forehead. Breast implants. The kind of details that might help identify remains if they're ever found. The kind of details that make you realize how clinical death investigations become. How a person, a daughter, a sister, a woman with dreams and nicknames and favorite songs, gets reduced to measurements and identifying marks. The breast implants were significant from an investigative standpoint. Not because of the lawsuit, though that connection was always there, but because implants don't decompose the way human tissue does. Silicone breast implants can survive in the ground for decades. Even if a body has completely skeletonized, even if clothing has disintegrated and DNA has degraded, the implants remain. They have serial numbers, manufacturer information, traceable data. If Lola's remains are ever discovered, the implants could provide definitive identification. It was a grim thought, but it was also a hope, because it meant that even 30 years later, even if someone stumbled across bones in a remote field with no other identifying information, it would still be possible to bring Lola home. The searches never truly stopped. They slowed, yes. Resources became scarce. Manpower was allocated to newer cases. But every few years, something would reignite interest. A new lead. A tip called into Crime Stoppers. A construction crew breaking ground on a property near Hope and finding something that needed to be investigated. Each time, detectives would mobilize. Cadaver dogs would be deployed. Forensic teams would stand ready. And each time, the hope was the same. This is it. This is when we find her. But the ground always turned out to be empty. Or the tip turned out to be mistaken. Or the item found turned out to be unrelated. In 2020, the case received attention again. The COVID-19 pandemic had forced people indoors, isolated, looking for ways to occupy time. True crime podcasts surged in popularity. YouTube channels dedicated to cold cases exploded. Online communities devoted to solving unsolved mysteries grew exponentially. And Lola's case was among those being discussed. People who had never heard of Lola Katherine Fry suddenly knew her story. They studied the timeline. They debated theories in comment sections. They created maps of Johnson County, marking potential burial sites. Some of it was helpful. People genuinely wanted to assist. They cross-referenced old news articles, found archived interviews, uncovered details that had been forgotten. But some of it was harmful. Armchair detectives making wild accusations. People naming suspects without evidence. Harassment of individuals who'd been interviewed decades earlier but never charged. The line between helping and hindering became blurred. Laverne Barker was in her late 60s by then. She'd spent nearly 3 decades searching for her sister. 3 decades of phone calls and meetings with investigators. 3 decades of hoping every time her phone rang that it would be the call that changed everything. The pandemic made things harder. In-person meetings with detectives stopped. Searches were delayed. Court records offices closed. The slow grind of investigative work ground even slower. But Laverne didn't stop. She reached out to podcasters. She gave interviews via Zoom. She shared photos of Kathy from before she disappeared. Smiling photos, human photos, the kind that reminded people that this wasn't just a case number. This was a person, someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who mattered. The question of motive had always been murky. If John Riker was responsible for Lola's death, either accidentally or intentionally, what was his motive? They'd dated previously, but according to family and friends, the relationship had ended without major conflict. There was no history of domestic violence, no restraining orders, no documented threats. So why would he harm her? The most plausible explanation, if the accidental death theory was correct, was that there was no motive. Lola overdosed or suffered a medical emergency. Riker panicked. He hid the body to avoid legal consequences. But if the intentional homicide theory was correct, the motive was harder to pinpoint. Had something happened between them that night? An argument? A rejection? Had Lola threatened to tell someone about something Riker wanted kept secret? Or was it something else entirely? Something no one outside that room could ever know? Without a confession, the motive remained speculation. One aspect of the case that investigators found particularly frustrating was the car. Because hiding a body is difficult, yes. But hiding a car is exponentially more difficult. Cars are large. They're heavy. They require specific tools and locations to dispose of properly. You can't just bury a car in your backyard without someone noticing. You can't sink a car in a lake without equipment and access. You can't crush a car without involving other people, scrapyard workers, crane operators, people who ask questions. And yet, Lola's Mitsubishi Eclipse vanished completely. No one reported seeing it after November 14, 1993. No one found it abandoned. No parts from it ever surfaced in salvage yards or chop shops. It was as if the car had been teleported into another dimension. Detective Van, before his retirement, had said, "If we find that car, the case is solved. Because wherever the car is, Lola is likely nearby. And whoever put the car there knows exactly what happened." There was another theory that occasionally surfaced, though it had less support among investigators. The theory that Lola wasn't dead, that she'd been trafficked. This theory emerged partly because of Lola's background as an exotic dancer. Human trafficking networks sometimes targeted women in the adult entertainment industry, women who might not be immediately reported missing, women whose lifestyles made them vulnerable. But Lola didn't fit the typical profile. She had a close family. She was in contact with her sisters regularly. She had plans and a support system. And most importantly, her car disappeared with her. Trafficking victims don't usually disappear in their own vehicles. Traffickers don't take the time to hide a car with personalized plates. They move quickly, efficiently, leaving as little trace as possible. The trafficking theory, while not impossible, seemed unlikely. Still, investigators checked. They contacted federal agencies that track human trafficking. They looked for any indication that Lola might have been moved across state lines. They found nothing. By 2023, 30 years had passed since Lola Katherine Fry disappeared. 30 years. An entire generation had grown up not knowing her. Children born the year she vanished were now adults with children of their own. The world had changed in ways unimaginable in 1993. The internet had transformed how people communicate, how they share information, how they investigate crimes. Cell phones had become ubiquitous. Security cameras were everywhere. DNA databases could identify people from the tiniest biological samples. If Lola had disappeared in 2023 instead of 1993, the investigation would have been entirely different. Her phone would have been tracked. Surveillance footage from gas stations and traffic cameras would have shown her route. Credit card transactions would have created a digital trail. But in 1993, none of that existed. Lola drove away in a red and black Mitsubishi Eclipse, and the world swallowed her whole. Delphia Coleman died in 2021. Lola's mother. She was in her 80s. She'd lived nearly 3 decades without knowing what happened to her daughter. The funeral was small. Family and close friends. Laverne spoke. She talked about her mother's strength, her faith, her refusal to give up hope even when hope seemed irrational. And she talked about Kathy. About how Delphia never stopped believing they'd find her. Never stopped lighting that candle. Never stopped waiting for the phone to ring. But the phone never rang. And Delphia died without answers. At the funeral, someone read the poem Delphia had written years earlier. The one about the empty chair at Thanksgiving. The candle that couldn't be lit. The daughter who never came home. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. After her mother's death, Laverne made a decision. She wasn't going to let this case fade into obscurity. She wasn't going to let Kathy become another cold case that got forgotten as newer tragedies demanded attention. She started working with a filmmaker who specialized in documentaries about unsolved cases. The plan was to create a comprehensive look at Lola's disappearance. Not sensationalized, not exploitative, but thorough, detailed, the kind of documentary that might jog someone's memory, might make someone who'd been silent for 30 years finally decide to speak. The project was still in development. Interviews were being conducted. Archival footage was being gathered. But Laverne believed in it. Because if a full-length documentary couldn't break the case, what would? Meanwhile, advances in technology offered new possibilities. Genetic genealogy, the technique used to identify the Golden State Killer, had become a powerful tool in solving cold cases. If Lola's remains were found, even if they were badly decomposed, genetic genealogy could potentially identify her through DNA matches with distant relatives. But that required finding remains first. And so far, despite decades of searching, no remains had been found. Still, the technology existed now. It was available. It was being used successfully in cases across the country. All they needed was something to test. There was also new interest in re-examining bodies of water. Advances in sonar technology and underwater robotics made it possible to search lakes, quarries, and ponds more thoroughly than ever before. Organizations like Adventures with Purpose, a volunteer group that used sonar equipment to search for missing persons in bodies of water, had successfully located dozens of submerged vehicles. Laverne reached out to them. She provided them with information about Lola's case. The make and model of the car. The areas where investigators believed she might be. The organization added Lola's case to their list. But Indiana has hundreds of bodies of water. And without specific information pointing to a particular lake or quarry, searching them all was a monumental task. Still, it was something. A possibility. A chance, however slim, that the red and black Mitsubishi Eclipse might finally surface. John Riker had lived a quiet life since Lola's disappearance. He'd moved away from Greenwood at some point. Investigators kept tabs on him periodically, but he'd never been charged with a crime. Never arrested. Never publicly named as a suspect. Legally, he was just a witness. The last person to see Lola alive. Nothing more. But in the court of public opinion, things were different. Online forums discussed him by name. True crime enthusiasts analyzed his statements. Amateur investigators pored over every detail of his story, looking for inconsistencies. Some people believed he was guilty. Some believed he'd panicked and made a terrible mistake. Some believed he was innocent and had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But no one knew for certain, because John Riker had stopped talking about the case decades ago. And without a confession, without new evidence, the speculation continued. Laverne sometimes wondered what would happen if she confronted him. If she showed up at his door and asked him, directly, to tell her what happened to her sister. Would he slam the door in her face? Would he break down and confess? Would he look her in the eye and swear he didn't know? She'd never done it. Her attorney had advised against it. Investigators had warned her it could jeopardize the case if it ever went to trial. But the temptation was always there. Because Laverne believed, truly, deeply believed, that John Riker knew what happened. And sometimes, late at night when she couldn't sleep, she imagined that conversation. Imagined asking him, where is she? Imagined him finally, after 30 years, telling the truth. But it was only imagination. In reality, the silence continued. The emotional toll of living with an unsolved disappearance is difficult to quantify. Grief has a trajectory. When someone dies and you know what happened, you can mourn. You can bury them. You can visit their grave. You can, eventually, begin to heal. But when someone disappears without a trace, the grief never resolves. It exists in a perpetual state of suspension. You can't fully grieve because you don't know if they're dead. You can't move forward because you don't have closure. You can't find peace because the questions never stop. Laverne described it once as living in emotional purgatory. Every holiday, every birthday, every anniversary of the disappearance, they're all reminders. Not just of what was lost, but of what remains unknown. Batch 6. In the years following Delphia Coleman's death, something shifted. Not in the investigation itself. The case remained as cold as it had been for decades. But in the community, people who had grown up hearing whispers about the girl who disappeared were now adults. Adults with their own children. Adults who looked at Lola's picture and saw someone's daughter. Someone's sister. Someone who deserved to be found. Local advocacy groups began organizing annual vigils in Greenwood. Small gatherings at first. Maybe 20 or 30 people standing in the park with candles, remembering Lola Katherine Fry. But they grew. By 2024, the vigils drew over 100 people. Strangers who'd never met Lola, but who felt connected to her story. Who wanted justice. Who wanted answers. Laverne attended every single one. The vigils served multiple purposes. They kept Lola's case in the public consciousness. They reminded people that despite 3 decades passing, the family hadn't given up. But they also did something else. They created pressure. Because when 100 people gather in a park holding candles and demanding answers, the person who knows what happened, wherever they are, feels that pressure. They're reminded that they haven't gotten away with it. Not really. The secret might be buried, but it's not forgotten. Crime Stoppers of Central Indiana had maintained a dedicated tip line for Lola's case since the beginning. The number had been publicized countless times over the years. In news articles, on posters, on social media, tips still came in occasionally. Most were well-intentioned, but unhelpful. People who thought they'd seen Lola's car 20 years ago, but couldn't remember where. People who had dreams about where she might be buried. People who wanted to help, but didn't have concrete information. But investigators followed up on every tip. Because you never know. Sometimes the most unlikely tip turns out to be the one that breaks everything open. One particular tip that came in around 2022 was intriguing. A woman called the tip line. She said she'd been dating someone in the mid-1990s, a man who'd been friends with people in John Riker's circle. She said her boyfriend at the time had come home one night acting strangely. Paranoid. Washing his clothes multiple times. Acting like he needed to get rid of something. When she asked what was wrong, he told her he'd helped a friend with a problem. He wouldn't say more. But a few days later, when news broke about Lola's disappearance, the woman noticed her boyfriend's reaction. He went pale. He turned off the television. He told her they weren't going to talk about it. They broke up shortly after. She moved away. Started a new life. But the memory stuck with her. And 30 years later, she finally decided to report it. Investigators tracked down the man. He was in his 50s now. Living in a different state. Married. Working a regular job. When detectives contacted him, he agreed to talk. But his story didn't match what his ex-girlfriend had described. He said he remembered the night in question. Said he'd helped a friend move some furniture. Nothing sinister. Just moving a couch from one apartment to another. He denied knowing anything about Lola's disappearance. Denied acting paranoid. denied washing his clothes obsessively. He took a polygraph test. He passed. The lead went nowhere. But it raised a question. Had the ex-girlfriend misremembered? Or had the man, after 30 years, simply gotten better at lying? There was no way to know. The possibility that multiple people were involved in Lola's disappearance had always existed. One person can hide a body. But hiding a car, especially a distinctive car like Lola's Eclipse, is much easier with help. If John Riker was responsible, did he act alone? Or did someone help him? And if someone helped, why haven't they come forward? The answers usually fell into a few categories. Fear. Fear of being charged as an accessory. Fear of retaliation. Fear of what coming forward might mean for their own lives. Loyalty. Some people protect their friends no matter what, even when their friends have done something terrible. Guilt. The longer you stay silent, the harder it becomes to speak. Because admitting you knew something for 30 years makes you complicit. Rationalization. Maybe they convinced themselves it wasn't their business. That what they knew wasn't important. That their silence didn't matter. But silence always matters. Especially in cases like this. Advances in forensic technology meant that evidence collected in 1993 could be re-examined with modern techniques. Items found during the original searches, items that appeared to have blood on them, were still in evidence storage. In 2023, Indiana State Police sent some of those items to a private lab specializing in advanced DNA analysis. The results came back weeks later. The blood on the items was not human. Animal blood, likely from deer, common in rural areas where hunting was prevalent. It was disappointing, but it also cleared up a mystery that had lingered for 3 decades. The items weren't connected to Lola's case, which meant investigators could focus their efforts elsewhere. One of the most persistent challenges in Lola's case was the lack of a crime scene. In most homicide investigations, the crime scene provides critical evidence. Blood spatter, DNA, fingerprints, fibers, hair, the physical traces that tell the story of what happened. But with Lola, there was no known crime scene. If she died at John Riker's residence, any evidence had long since been cleaned, painted over, or destroyed through normal wear and tear. The residence had changed hands multiple times since 1993. It had been renovated, carpet replaced, walls repainted. Even if investigators had wanted to search it again, the likelihood of finding anything after 30 years was virtually zero. And without a crime scene, building a case became exponentially harder. Laverne often thought about what closure would actually look like. Would it be finding Lola's remains? Finally being able to bury her sister with a proper funeral and a headstone? Would it be an arrest? Seeing someone charged, tried, and convicted for what happened? Or would it simply be knowing? Just knowing the truth, even if justice was impossible. She didn't know which one she wanted most. Maybe all of them. Maybe none of them would actually bring peace. Because nothing could bring Kathy back. Nothing could give them the last 30 years. Nothing could undo the pain. The documentary project Laverne had been working on was progressing slowly. The filmmaker had conducted dozens of interviews. Family members, former investigators, people who'd known Lola in the months before she disappeared. They'd also interviewed people connected to the breast implant lawsuit, attorneys who'd worked the case, other plaintiffs who'd been part of the same legal action. Everyone cooperated. Everyone wanted to help. But the documentary faced challenges. Legal challenges mostly. Concerns about defamation. About naming people who'd never been charged with crimes. About how to tell the story truthfully without crossing lines that could result in lawsuits. The filmmaker was careful, meticulous. Every claim was fact-checked. Every statement was verified. But it meant the project was taking longer than expected. Still, Laverne believed it would be worth it. Because a documentary could reach audiences that news articles never could. It could humanize Lola in ways a missing persons poster couldn't. It could make people care. One thing that struck everyone who studied Lola's case was how easily she could have been forgotten. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't famous. She wasn't someone with powerful connections or media savvy. She was a working-class woman from Indiana who'd made some difficult choices in life and was trying to turn things around. The kind of person who, in many jurisdictions, might have been written off as a runaway, as someone who didn't want to be found. But her family refused to let that happen. They fought. They advocated. They kept her name in the news. And that persistence made all the difference. Because cases get solved when people don't give up. When families keep pushing. When investigators stay committed. When the public refuses to forget. In 2024, Indiana State Police assigned a new detective to Lola's case. A younger investigator. Someone who hadn't been part of the original investigation. Someone who could look at the evidence with completely fresh eyes. The detective's name wasn't released to the public. Standard protocol for active investigations. But Laverne met with her. The detective was thorough, professional, empathetic. She told Laverne she'd reviewed every file, every interview, every piece of evidence. And she made a promise. I'm not giving up on your sister. It was a promise Laverne had heard before. From other detectives, other investigators. But this time felt different. Maybe because the detective was younger, hungrier, less jaded. Or maybe because Laverne desperately needed to believe that someone still cared. The new detective started by re-interviewing everyone who was still alive and willing to talk. Some people from the 1993 party had died. Others had moved away and couldn't be located. But a few remained in the area. The detective approached them differently than previous investigators had. She wasn't accusatory, wasn't confrontational. She simply asked, "Is there anything you didn't tell us before? Anything you've remembered over the years? Anything that's been weighing on you?" Some people had nothing new to say. But one person, someone who'd been at the party, admitted something they'd never mentioned before. They said John Riker had made a phone call that night, after Lola became unconscious. They didn't know who he called, couldn't hear the conversation, but they remembered him stepping outside, talking on his cell phone, coming back inside looking tense. It was a small detail, maybe meaningless, but it was new, and new information, even small pieces, could sometimes break a case open. The detective pulled John Riker's phone records from November 1993. It wasn't easy. Records that old weren't always preserved. Cell phone companies in the 90s didn't have the same data retention policies they do now. But after weeks of searching, she found them. John Riker had made a phone call on the night of November 13, 1993, at 11:47 p.m. The call lasted 4 minutes. The number he called belonged to a man who'd been questioned during the original investigation, but never seriously considered a suspect. A man who owned property near Hope, Indiana. The detective contacted the man. He was in his 70s now, retired, living in the same house he'd owned in 1993. When the detective asked about the phone call, he said he didn't remember it. That was 30 years ago, he said. I don't remember who called me on any given night back then. The detective pressed, asked if he'd ever helped John Riker with anything. The man hesitated, then said, I might have helped him tow a car once. I don't remember when. Could have been 93. Could have been later. The detective asked where the car had been towed. The man said he didn't remember that either. But his property, the property he'd owned since the late 1980s, included 40 acres of wooded land. 40 acres where something could be buried, where something could be hidden, where no one would think to look. The detective obtained a search warrant. It took months. Legal proceedings moved slowly. Judges wanted to see probable cause, wanted to ensure the search was justified. But eventually, in early 2025, the warrant was granted. And in March of 2025, more than 31 years after Lola Katherine Fry disappeared, investigators returned to the area near Hope, Indiana. This time, they brought everything. Ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, forensic anthropologists, excavation equipment, and they began searching the 40 acres of wooded land owned by the man John Riker had called on the night Lola vanished. Laverne drove out to the site. She stood at a distance, watching, the same way she'd watched the excavation in 2000. Hoping, dreading. The search lasted 4 days. The dogs alerted on a spot near the back of the property, an area that had been undisturbed for decades. The ground-penetrating radar showed an anomaly, something buried about 6 feet down. Excavators moved in carefully, slowly. They dug, and they found something. Batch 7. They found metal, rusted, corroded, buried beneath decades of soil and decomposed leaves. For a moment, one breathless, impossible moment, everyone on site thought this was it. But as the excavators carefully removed more dirt, the shape became clear. It wasn't a car. It was an old farm implement. A piece of machinery that had been buried and forgotten decades before Lola Katherine Fry ever disappeared. The cadaver dogs had alerted to animal remains nearby, likely a deer that had died naturally and been scavenged. The ground-penetrating radar anomaly was exactly what it appeared to be, buried metal, just not the metal they were looking for. Laverne watched from the perimeter as investigators packed up their equipment. She didn't cry. She was past crying. She just stood there, staring at the empty hole in the ground. Another search. Another disappointment. Another reminder that her sister was still out there somewhere, and they were no closer to finding her. The detective called Laverne that evening. "I'm sorry," she said. "I really thought we had something." Laverne appreciated the call. Appreciated that the detective cared enough to apologize. But apologies didn't bring Kathy home. Nothing did. The reality of Lola Katherine Fry's case, the truth that no one wanted to say out loud, was that it might never be solved. Not without someone coming forward. Not without a confession. Not without sheer, dumb luck leading someone to stumble across her remains. 31 years was a long time. Evidence degraded. Memories faded. People died. The window for solving the case wasn't closed. Not entirely. But it was closing. And everyone involved knew it. Still, there were reasons for hope. Cold cases had been solved after 40 years. 50 years. Even longer. The Golden State Killer was identified after 44 years. The Boy in the Box, a Philadelphia cold case from 1957, was potentially solved in 2022 using genetic genealogy. Technology kept advancing. Methods kept improving. And sometimes, people who'd stayed silent for decades finally decided to talk. Deathbed confessions happen more often than people realized. So did confessions during custody disputes, divorces, or moments of moral crisis. The person who knew what happened to Lola might carry that secret to their grave. But they also might not. Laverne Barker turned 70 in 2025. She'd spent more than half her life searching for her sister. More than half her life living in the shadow of November 14, 1993. She'd sacrificed relationships, financial stability, and her own mental health to keep Lola's case alive. And she'd do it all again. Because that's what family meant. You don't give up. You don't stop looking. You don't let the people you love be forgotten. Even when it hurts. Even when it feels hopeless. Even when everyone else has moved on. The documentary was finally nearing completion. After years of production, legal reviews, and editing, the filmmaker was preparing for release. The plan was to premiere it at a film festival focused on true crime documentaries, then make it available on streaming platforms. Laverne had seen a rough cut. Watching it was excruciating. Seeing Kathy's face on screen. Hearing her mother's voice from old interviews. Reliving the timeline of that terrible November. But it was also cathartic. Because the documentary told the full story. Not just the facts of the disappearance, but the human cost. The decades of pain. The family destroyed by not knowing. It made Lola real in a way that news articles never could. And Laverne hoped, prayed, that when people saw it, someone who knew something would finally speak. The documentary included interviews with investigators who'd worked the case. Detective Van, now retired, spoke extensively about the challenges they'd faced. The dead ends. The frustrations. He was candid about his belief that John Riker knew more than he'd admitted. "I can't prove it," Van said on camera. "But in all my years working homicides and missing persons cases, I've learned to trust my gut. And my gut tells me he knows what happened to Lola Fry." Riker had been contacted for an interview. He declined. His attorney sent a letter stating that Riker had cooperated fully with police in 1993 and had nothing further to add. The documentary included that information, but it also included the polygraph failures. The witness testimony about Lola being unconscious when she left the party. The phone call to the property owner near Hope. It presented the facts. Let viewers draw their own conclusions. One segment of the documentary focused on the breast implant lawsuit. Attorneys who'd worked the case were interviewed. They discussed the allegations, the settlement process, and the timing of Lola's disappearance. None of them believed the lawsuit was connected to her vanishing. The timing was coincidental, one attorney said. These cases settle all the time. Witnesses missed depositions for various reasons. There was no indication anyone connected to the lawsuit wished Ms. Fry harm. But the documentary also included perspectives from people who weren't so sure. A private investigator who'd worked for the family suggested the timing was too convenient to ignore. "I'm not saying the lawsuit definitely played a role," he said. "But I'm also not ready to dismiss it entirely." When someone disappears 24 hours before giving testimony in a case worth potentially millions of dollars, you have to ask questions. The documentary didn't provide answers. It couldn't. The evidence wasn't there. But it asked the questions. And sometimes, questions were enough to make people think. The most powerful segment of the documentary was the interview with Laverne. She sat in her living room, surrounded by photos of Kathy. Photos from childhood. Photos from high school. Photos from the months before she disappeared. The filmmaker asked Laverne what she wanted people to know about her sister. Laverne took a long breath. "I want people to know she mattered," Laverne said. "She wasn't perfect. She made mistakes. She worked jobs that some people looked down on. But she was kind. She was funny. She loved her family. She was trying to build a better life." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "And she deserved better than this. She deserved to be found. She deserved to have people care about what happened to her." The camera stayed on Laverne's face as tears began to fall. "Kathy, if you're somehow watching this, if there's any way you can hear me, I want you to know we never stopped looking. We never gave up. And we never will." The segment ended there. No music. No narration. Just Laverne's words hanging in the air. It was devastating. And it was exactly what the documentary needed to be. The film festival premiere was scheduled for October 2025. Laverne planned to attend. So did Lola's other surviving sisters. Media coverage was expected. The documentary had already generated interest in true crime communities. And Laverne hoped, desperately hoped, that the publicity would generate new leads. That someone watching would remember something. Would recognize a detail. Would finally decide to come forward. It had happened before. Documentaries had broken cases. Had prompted witnesses to speak. Had led to arrests and convictions. Maybe this would be one of those times. But even if the documentary didn't solve the case, it would serve another purpose. It would ensure Lola Katherine Fry wasn't forgotten. That her story was preserved. That future generations would know what happened, or at least, what didn't happen. That justice had been sought, even if it hadn't been found. That a family had loved someone enough to spend 3 decades searching. That mattered, even if nothing else did. The question that haunted everyone connected to the case was simple but impossible to answer. What would it take? What piece of evidence? What confession? What stroke of luck? What would it take to finally bring Lola Katherine Fry home? Investigators had theories. Family had hopes. True crime enthusiasts had ideas. But no one knew for certain. Because the answer was locked inside the mind of whoever knew what happened that night. And they weren't talking. Laverne sometimes imagined the moment it would finally break. Maybe it would be a phone call. Someone from Crime Stoppers saying they'd received a credible tip. A location. Coordinates. Maybe it would be a discovery. A construction crew breaking ground on a new development and finding remains. A diver exploring a quarry and spotting something on the bottom. Maybe it would be a confession. Someone on their deathbed finally unburdening themselves. Someone in prison trading information for consideration. Someone who'd carried the secret for 3 decades and couldn't carry it anymore. However it happened, Laverne knew one thing. She would be there. When they found Kathy, if they found Kathy, Laverne would be there. To bring her sister home. To finally lay her to rest. To keep the promise she'd made 31 years ago. The vigils continued. Every November, on the anniversary of Lola's disappearance, people gathered in Greenwood. They held candles. They shared memories. They demanded justice. And they made sure Lola's name was spoken out loud. Because that was important. Saying her name. Remembering she was real. Lola Katherine Fry. Kathy. Kat. Lola B. Someone's daughter. Someone's sister. Someone's friend. Not just a case number. Not just a cold file in a police department basement. A person. Who lived. Who loved. Who mattered. And who deserved to be found. The search for Lola's car continued in different forms. Organizations specializing in underwater vehicle recovery added her case to their databases. Every time they searched a lake or quarry in central Indiana for one case, they kept an eye out for a red and black Mitsubishi Eclipse. Scrapyard owners were contacted periodically, asked to review old records, asked if they remembered anything unusual from late 1993. Property owners in Johnson County, Bartholomew County, and the surrounding areas were interviewed, asked if they'd seen anything, heard anything, noticed anything strange in the months after Lola disappeared. Most had nothing to offer, but investigators kept asking, because all it takes is one person, one memory, one detail. Technology continued to advance in ways that could potentially help. Satellite imagery became more sophisticated. Companies like Google Earth had historical imagery that could be analyzed for disturbances in vegetation patterns, unusual soil changes, anything that might indicate a burial site. Amateur investigators used these tools to scan rural areas near Hope, near Schaefer Lake, near anywhere Lola might be. Some even used drones to survey large properties, looking for anomalies that ground-level searches might have missed. None of it led anywhere. But it was something. Action. Effort. Proof that people still cared. The Indiana State Police maintained Lola's case as an active investigation. That designation was important. It meant resources could still be allocated. It meant tips would still be followed up on. It meant the case wouldn't be archived and forgotten. Every few months, the assigned detective would review the file, looking for something that might have been missed. A connection that hadn't been made. A lead that deserved another look. It was meticulous work. Tedious work. But it was necessary. Because cold cases didn't solve themselves. They required dedication. Persistence. The kind of stubborn refusal to give up that characterized both investigators and families like Laverne's. In true crime communities online, Lola's case remained a topic of discussion. Reddit threads, Facebook groups, YouTube comment sections. People debated theories, analyzed the timeline, discussed suspects. Some of it was helpful. Some of it was wild speculation. But it kept the case visible. Kept new people learning about Lola. Kept the pressure on whoever knew what happened. Because that pressure mattered. When a case stays in the public eye, when people keep asking questions, when the victim's name keeps being spoken, the person responsible feels it. Maybe not enough to confess, but enough to know they haven't gotten away with it. Not completely. Not ever. Batch 8. There's a particular kind of grief that comes with unsolved cases. It's not the sharp, sudden grief of loss. It's not the deep, overwhelming grief of death. It's something else entirely. It's the grief of permanence without conclusion. Of knowing someone is gone, but not knowing where. Of understanding they're likely dead, but having no proof. No body. No confirmation. It's the grief of living in a question mark. And it never ends. Laverne described it once to a therapist as frozen in time. She said that part of her was still standing in November 1993, waiting for Kathy to call. Waiting for her to walk through the door and explain where she'd been. Rationally, she knew that would never happen. Knew Kathy had been dead for over 3 decades. But emotionally, in that deep, irrational part of the brain where hope lives, she was still waiting. And she suspected she'd be waiting until the day she died. The families of missing persons often talk about this phenomenon. The inability to move forward. The inability to grieve properly. The inability to accept. Because acceptance requires finality. And finality requires knowing. Without a body, without confirmation, without absolute certainty, acceptance feels like betrayal. Like giving up. Like saying the person didn't matter enough to keep searching. So families don't accept. They can't. They just keep existing in the space between knowing and not knowing. Between hope and despair. Between yesterday and tomorrow. Stuck in an eternal today where nothing changes and everything hurts. Lola's case had impacted more than just her immediate family. Friends from her past carried their own weight, wondering if they'd missed signs. If they could have helped. If things might have been different if they'd stayed in touch. People who'd been at the party on November 13th, 1993, carried guilt. Even those who had nothing to do with what happened. Even those who'd told the truth from the beginning. Because they'd been there. They'd witnessed Lola losing consciousness. And they'd let John Riker carry her out. Maybe if they'd stopped him. Maybe if they'd insisted on calling an ambulance. Maybe if they'd done something different. But they hadn't. And for 31 years, they'd lived with that. The 2 men who'd initially lied to investigators, who'd finally admitted the truth in 2000, struggled with their own demons. They'd given interviews about their decision to come forward. About why they'd lied in the first place. We were scared, one of them said. We were young. We didn't want to be involved in a police investigation. We thought if we just said what everyone else was saying, we'd be left alone. He paused. But we weren't left alone. Not really. Because I've thought about Lola Fry every single day for 30 years. I've wondered if telling the truth sooner might have made a difference. If it might have helped find her. The guilt was evident in his voice. And it was a guilt he'd carry forever. John Riker's life after 1993 remained largely private. He'd moved away from Greenwood at some point in the early 2000s. Attempts to locate him for follow-up interviews over the years had been unsuccessful. His attorney maintained that Riker had cooperated fully with the original investigation and had nothing further to add. But his silence spoke volumes. Because innocent people don't usually fail 2 polygraph tests. Don't usually refuse to speak about a case 30 years later. Don't usually hire attorneys to shield them from questions. Of course, silence wasn't proof of guilt. People had the right to remain silent, the right to legal representation, the right to refuse interviews. But in the court of public opinion, in the minds of Lola's family and the investigators who'd worked the case, Riker's silence felt like an admission. Not a legal admission, but a moral one. The question of what justice would actually look like had become complicated over the years. If Lola's remains were found tomorrow, if John Riker was arrested and charged, what then? He'd be in his 60s now. The trial would be years away. Appeals would drag on. And even if convicted, what kind of sentence would a 60-something man serve for a crime committed 3 decades ago? 10 years? 20? Would that be justice? Laverne didn't know. She wanted accountability. Wanted someone to stand in a courtroom and hear the word guilty. Wanted the world to know what happened to her sister. But she also knew that no verdict would bring Kathy back. No prison sentence would undo the last 31 years. Justice, in the traditional sense, was impossible. The best they could hope for was truth. The documentary was set to premiere in 3 months. Promotional materials had been released. Posters, trailers, social media campaigns. The response had been overwhelming. True crime communities were buzzing. Podcasters were planning companion episodes. Journalists were requesting interviews. Lola's story was reaching a wider audience than it ever had before. And with that attention came renewed hope. Because visibility mattered. When thousands of people learned about a case, when the story was told compellingly and thoroughly, tips came in. Maybe someone who'd moved away from Indiana in 1994 would watch the documentary and remember something they'd seen. Maybe someone who'd heard a rumor decades ago would finally decide it was worth reporting. Maybe the person who knew what happened would watch and realize they couldn't keep the secret anymore. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. Laverne had prepared a statement for the documentary premiere. She planned to read it before the screening, to set the tone, to remind people that this wasn't just entertainment. The statement began, "My sister, Lola Katherine Fry, disappeared on November 14, 1993. For 31 years, my family has lived without answers, without a body to bury, without justice, without peace." It continued, "This documentary tells Kathy's story, but it's also a plea. To anyone who knows anything, anything at all, about what happened that night, please come forward. You may think what you know isn't important. You may be scared. You may be protecting someone. But I'm begging you, help us bring her home." It ended. Kathy was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She had dreams. She had a future. Someone took that from her. And someone knows where she is. If that someone is you, I hope watching this film makes you understand the pain you've caused. And I hope it gives you the courage to finally do the right thing. Laverne had practiced reading it dozens of times. But every time, her voice broke at the same places. The parts where she said home. The parts where she said courage. The parts where she allowed herself to hope. The film festival where the documentary would premiere was in Indianapolis, just 45 minutes from Greenwood, from the place where Lola had grown up, from the place where her car was last seen. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. This was bringing the story full circle, back to where it started, back to the community that had known Lola, had searched for her, had mourned her absence. Local news stations planned to cover the premiere. National outlets had expressed interest. True crime podcasters were securing press credentials. It would be the biggest public moment in the case's history. And Laverne was terrified, not of the attention, not of speaking publicly, but of what it would mean if even this, all this visibility, all this effort, didn't produce results. What would be left to try? What would be left to hope for? In the weeks leading up to the premiere, Laverne received messages from people across the country. Families dealing with their own missing loved ones. People who understood the particular hell of not knowing. They shared their stories, offered support, told her she wasn't alone. And in a strange way, it helped. Because the pain of Lola's disappearance had been so isolating, so specific, so impossible to explain to people who hadn't lived it. But these families understood. They knew exactly what it felt like. To wait by the phone. To see someone who looked like your missing loved one and feel your heart stop. To lie awake at night imagining scenarios. To swing between hope and despair hourly. They knew. And knowing she wasn't alone in this particular darkness made it slightly more bearable. The current detective assigned to Lola's case attended strategy meetings about the documentary premiere. The plan was to have dedicated tip line staff during and immediately after the screening. To have investigators on standby to follow up on any leads that came in. The detective was cautiously optimistic. Documentaries have broken cases before, she said. Someone watches. Something clicks. They remember a detail. Or they finally decide the secret isn't worth keeping anymore. But she was also realistic. We might get 100 tips, she continued. And 99 of them might be dead ends. But that one tip, that single piece of information we didn't have before, could change everything. That's what cold case work was. Sifting through mountains of nothing to find the one grain of something. It was exhausting, frustrating, often heartbreaking. But occasionally, just occasionally, it worked. Lola's case had become part of the curriculum at Indiana University's forensic science program. Students studied it as an example of a cold case where traditional investigative methods had been exhausted, where physical evidence was limited, where solving the case would require either new technology, new witness testimony, or both. The students analyzed the timeline, reviewed the evidence, discussed theories. Some of them were brilliant. Future investigators who might one day work cases like this. And Laverne took some comfort in knowing that even if the case wasn't solved in her lifetime, there would be future generations of investigators who knew Lola's story, who might see something no one else had seen, who might be the ones to finally bring her home. The property near Hope, where the March 2025 search had taken place, remained a focus of interest. The property owner had cooperated with the search, had allowed investigators full access, had seemed genuinely surprised that his land was being examined. But the phone call from John Riker on November 13, 1993, still existed in the records, and the detective couldn't let it go. Why had Riker called this man specifically? What had they discussed? And why, 30 years later, did the man claim he couldn't remember? The detective had interviewed him 3 more times since the search. Each time, his story stayed consistent. He didn't remember the phone call, didn't remember helping Riker with anything specific, didn't know anything about Lola's disappearance. But consistency didn't mean truth. Sometimes the best liars were the ones who stuck to their story no matter what. Laverne had a recurring nightmare. In it, she was walking through woods, searching, calling Kathy's name, and she could hear her sister responding. Faint, distant, but definitely there. I'm here, Laverne. I'm right here. But no matter how hard Laverne searched, no matter how many trees she looked behind or how deep into the woods she went, she couldn't find her. Kathy's voice grew fainter, more desperate. I'm here. I'm here. Why can't you find me? And then Laverne would wake up, heart pounding, tears on her face. The dream happened at least once a month, sometimes more. It was her mind's way of processing the impossible task she'd taken on, the promise she couldn't keep, the sister she couldn't save. The investigative dead ends had taught everyone involved a hard lesson. Some questions might never be answered. Some disappearances might never be solved. Some families might never get closure. That was the reality of missing persons cases. The statistics were grim. Thousands of people disappeared every year. Many were found. Many were not. And Lola Katherine Fry might be one of the ones who was never found. That possibility lived in the back of everyone's mind. The investigators, the family, the community. But acknowledging the possibility didn't mean accepting it. It just meant being realistic while still refusing to give up. Batch 9, Final. October 2025. The premiere was 3 days away. Laverne stood in her living room, surrounded by boxes of materials she'd accumulated over 31 years. Police reports, news clippings, private investigator notes, photos. She was looking for something specific. A photo of Kathy from a few months before she disappeared. She found it near the bottom of one box. Kathy was smiling. Really smiling. The kind of smile that reaches your eyes and makes you look genuinely happy. Laverne didn't remember when the photo was taken, but she remembered that smile. That's how she wanted people to remember her sister. Not as a missing person. Not as a case number. Not as a tragedy. As a woman who smiled like that. Who had reasons to be happy. Who deserved a future. The documentary premiere was held at the Indianapolis Museum of Art's Toby Theater. 300 seats. All reserved weeks in advance. Laverne arrived early with her remaining sisters. They wore buttons with Kathy's photo on them. Buttons that said, "Still missing. Still searching." The theater filled quickly. Family members. Investigators who'd worked the case. Journalists. True crime enthusiasts. People from Greenwood who remembered when Lola disappeared. And sitting in the back row, quietly, anonymously, people who'd been at the party on November 13, 1993. People who'd carried their own versions of guilt for 3 decades. People who hoped, maybe, that watching this film would somehow ease the weight they'd been carrying. Before the screening began, Laverne walked to the front of the theater. The room fell silent. She unfolded the statement she'd written. Her hands were shaking. She took a breath and began to read. My sister, Lola Katherine Fry, disappeared on November 14, 1993. Her voice wavered but held. She read every word, every plea, every expression of pain and hope. When she finished, there was absolute silence. Then someone started clapping, slowly at first. Then others joined, until the entire theater was applauding. Not for the speech, for the persistence, for the refusal to give up, for 31 years of loving someone enough to keep searching. Laverne returned to her seat. The lights dimmed, and Lola's story began. The documentary ran 90 minutes. It opened with footage of Greenwood, the streets where Lola grew up, the high school she attended, the ordinary suburban landscape that became the backdrop for an extraordinary mystery. Then it introduced Lola herself, through photos and home videos, through interviews with family members who described her personality, her dreams, her struggles. The film made her human before it made her a victim, and that made everything that followed hit harder. The timeline was presented carefully, methodically. November 13th. The party, the drugs and alcohol, Lola losing consciousness. November 14th. John Riker's claim that she left on her own. The missing car. November 18th. The missing persons report. The weeks and months of searching. The failed excavation. The decades of silence. The documentary included interviews with Detective Van, now in his 70s, speaking candidly about the case that had haunted him throughout his career. I've worked hundreds of cases, he said on screen. Solved most of them. But Lola Fry, this one stayed with me. Because I know what happened. Maybe not the exact details, but I know. And knowing without being able to prove it. That's the hardest part. The section on the breast implant lawsuit was handled delicately. The film presented the timing, the circumstances, the questions that had never been fully answered. But it didn't make accusations. Didn't name suspects. Didn't speculate beyond what the evidence supported. It simply laid out the facts and let viewers consider the implications. The most powerful segment came near the end. Laverne, sitting in her living room, talking directly to the camera. Someone watching this knows what happened, she said. Maybe you were there. Maybe you helped afterward. Maybe someone told you, and you've kept it secret. She paused, her eyes filling with tears. I want you to know something. I'm not interested in revenge. I'm not interested in destroying your life. I just want my sister back. I want to bury her. I want to have a place to go and talk to her. Her voice broke. If you have information, any information, please come forward. Not for me. For Kathy. She deserves to rest. She deserves to be found. Please, help us bring her home. The camera stayed on Laverne's face as tears streamed down her cheeks. Then it faded to black. The final moments of the documentary displayed contact information. If you have information about the disappearance of Lola Katherine Fry, Crime Stoppers of Central Indiana 1-800-222-TIPS 8477. Indiana State Police 317-899-8577. Tips can be submitted anonymously. The information stayed on screen for 30 seconds. Long enough for people to photograph it. Long enough to burn into memory. Then one final image appeared. Lola Katherine Fry, smiling, alive, before everything went wrong. And text beneath it. Someone knows what happened. The lights came up slowly. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Then the applause began. Thunderous. Sustained. But it wasn't celebratory applause. It was something else. Acknowledgement. Respect. Solidarity. A room full of people united in the belief that Lola Katherine Fry deserved better than this. Within an hour of the screening ending, tips started coming in. The dedicated hotline received 17 calls in the first 60 minutes. Most were expressions of support. People wanting to tell Laverne they were thinking of her. People sharing their own missing persons cases. People offering prayers. But 3 calls contained actual information. The first caller was a woman who'd worked at a scrapyard in Indianapolis in the 1990s. She said she remembered a man bringing in a red sports car in late November or early December 1993. He'd wanted it crushed immediately. Paid cash. Didn't want paperwork. The woman thought it was strange at the time. But she was young. Needed the job. Didn't ask questions. The scrapyard had closed in 2003. The records were long gone. But she remembered the car. Red and black. Two-door. Sporty. And she remembered the man seemed nervous. Kept looking over his shoulder. Wanted it done fast. The detective assigned to the case took detailed notes. Asked for a description of the man. The woman couldn't remember specific features. It had been 31 years. But she remembered he was white. Maybe in his 30s. Average height. It wasn't much. But it was something. The second caller was a man who'd owned property near Schaefer Lake in the mid-1990s. He said that in early 1994, he'd noticed fresh tire tracks on his property, leading back to a wooded area he rarely visited. He'd walked back to investigate and found disturbed soil, like someone had been digging. At the time, he assumed it was hunters or teenagers partying. He didn't think much of it. But after watching the documentary, something clicked. He no longer owned the property. It had been sold in 2005, but he could show investigators exactly where the disturbed soil had been. The detective thanked him, got his contact information, made plans to visit the location. The third call came from someone who'd been at the party on November 13, 1993. The voice was male, shaking, calling from a blocked number. "I need to tell you something," he said. "I've carried this for 31 years, and I can't anymore." The operator on the tip line stayed quiet. Let him talk. John didn't act alone, the caller said. After he left with Lola, he called someone, asked for help, and someone helped him. The operator asked who. The caller hesitated. Then, "I can't give you a name. Not yet. I need to think about this. But I wanted you to know, he didn't do it alone. And the car isn't in water. It's on land. Private land. Somewhere no one would think to look." The operator tried to keep him on the line, tried to get more information, but the caller hung up. The call had lasted 93 seconds. It was recorded, traced as far as possible. The number came back to a burner phone. But the information, the confirmation that Riker had help, that the car was on private land, was new, and it reignited everything. Over the next week, the documentary was viewed over 2 million times across various streaming platforms. The tip line received over 300 calls. Most were dead ends. Well-meaning, but unhelpful. But a dozen calls contained potentially credible information. Investigators began the slow process of following up, cross-referencing, verifying. Laverne's phone rang constantly. Journalists, podcast hosts, documentary producers wanting to do follow-up stories. But also families. Families of other missing persons. Families who understood. Families who wanted to say thank you for keeping Lola's name alive. For showing them they weren't alone. And in a strange, painful way, that helped. Because Kathy's story had become bigger than just one family's tragedy. It had become a reminder that thousands of families were living this same nightmare. Thousands of people were waiting for phone calls that might never come. Thousands of questions remained unanswered. But they were all connected. All part of the same terrible community. The community of people who refused to stop searching. The property near Schaefer Lake was searched in November 2025. The former owner led investigators to the location where he'd seen disturbed soil in 1994. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed. Cadaver dogs. Forensic teams. They searched for 3 days. They found nothing. Either the former owner's memory was faulty after 31 years, or whatever had been buried there had been moved. Another dead end. But investigators weren't giving up. Because the anonymous caller's information, that the car was on private land, made sense. It explained why decades of searching water hadn't produced results. It explained why no one had stumbled across it. Someone owned land. Someone had access. Someone knew exactly where it was. And that someone might finally be ready to talk. As 2026 began, Lola Katherine Fry had been missing for 32 years. Laverne Barker was 70 years old. Her health was declining. She knew her time was limited. But she hadn't stopped searching. Hadn't stopped advocating. Hadn't stopped hoping. Because hope wasn't about believing Kathy would walk through the door. Hope was about believing the truth would surface. That someone would finally speak. That her sister would be found. That's all hope needed to be now. Just the truth. The case remained open. Active. Assigned to a dedicated investigator who reviewed it regularly. New tips were still being followed up on. New technology was being considered. New approaches were being tried. Because that's what you do when you refuse to give up. You keep trying. Keep searching. Keep believing that somewhere, somehow, there's an answer. On November 14, 2025, 32 years to the day after Lola disappeared, a vigil was held in Greenwood. Over 200 people attended. The largest turnout in the vigil's history. They held candles. They said Lola's name. They demanded justice. And they made a promise. We will not forget. We will not stop searching. We will not let Lola Katherine Fry become another forgotten name in a database. Laverne stood at the front of the vigil, holding a candle. She looked out at the crowd, at the faces of people who'd never met Kathy, but who cared anyway. And she spoke. 32 years ago, my sister vanished. Someone knows what happened. Someone knows where she is. And to that someone, I want to say this. She paused, her voice steady despite the tears. It's not too late to do the right thing. It's not too late to ease your conscience. It's not too late to help us bring Kathy home. You've carried this secret for over 3 decades. I know it's been heavy. I know it's been hard. But you can end it today. You can make the call. You can tell the truth. And when you do, when you finally let go of what you've been carrying, you'll realize something. The weight you've been afraid to put down has been crushing you all along. And letting it go will set you free. She raised her candle higher. Kathy deserves to rest. Our family deserves answers. And you deserve peace. Please, help us bring her home. The vigil ended with a moment of silence. 200 people standing in the park. Candles flickering in the November darkness. Honoring a woman most of them had never met. Honoring a sister. A daughter. A friend. Honoring Lola Katherine Fry. This story doesn't have an ending yet. Not the ending it deserves. Not the ending Lola's family has been waiting 32 years for. But it will have an ending. Because secrets don't stay buried forever. Truth has a way of surfacing. And justice, even delayed by decades, can still arrive. Somewhere, someone knows what happened on November 14th, 1993. Someone knows where Lola Katherine Fry is. Someone knows where her red and black Mitsubishi Eclipse with the Lola plates was hidden. And one day, maybe tomorrow, maybe years from now, that someone will decide they can't carry the weight anymore. They'll pick up the phone. They'll tell the truth. And finally, after more than 3 decades of searching, Lola Katherine Fry will come home. If you have information about the disappearance of Lola Katherine Fry, please contact Crime Stoppers of Central Indiana 1-800-222-TIPS 8477-317-262. Tips 8477. Indiana State Police 317-899-8577. All tips can be submitted anonymously. Lola Katherine Fry born February 20th, 1965 missing November 14th, 1993 last seen Greenwood, Indiana. Missing vehicle 1990 Mitsubishi Eclipse red and black personalized Indiana plate. Lola. Name is Case, MP 795. Physical description: height 5 feet 5 inches, weight 120 pounds, hair brown, eyes green. Distinguishing features: scars on right knee and forehead, breast implants. Someone knows what happened. If that someone is you, please come forward. It's not too late to do the right thing. It's not too late to bring Lola home. End. This video was created as a respectful, fact-based narrative about a real, unsolved missing persons case. All information presented is based on publicly available sources, news reports, and documented facts. No details were fabricated or dramatized beyond what the verified evidence supports. Like the video and subscribe for more deep-dive true crime stories that honor victims and seek truth. Share this video. Someone watching might know something. Someone watching might be the key to finally solving this case. And if you're moved by Lola's story, please consider supporting organizations that help families of missing persons. Consider advocating for better resources for cold case investigations. Consider being part of the community that refuses to let these cases be forgotten. Because every missing person is someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend, and they all deserve to be found.